afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our API webinar. Happy New Year, if I haven't spoken to any of you before. So my name's Holly. I look after some of our accounts at Pan Intelligence. And today's webinar is going to be looking at the new API. So API is a topical conversation at the moment. Everybody's wanting to understand how to best use APIs. And we've had a little bit of a change round in Pan Intelligence about our API. So today's webinar is going to be discussing that. We don't think it'll take the full hour, but it depends on how many questions you guys ping in. So the brief is going to be a very brief presentation where Ken, our CTO, is going to talk through some of the new changes, why we've made the changes, and what that means for you. So I'm just going to hand over to Ken now, and then Ming is going to do a demonstration to show more practically how you would use the API and where to find some documentation on how to use it at the end. As always, there's the chat box open and the questions tab. So if you have any questions or any comments that you would like to make throughout the webinar, please pop them in the chat, and then I'll be feeding them back into Ming at the end of the presentation. So Ken, I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Holly, and good afternoon, everybody, or morning or evening, depending wherever you are. I'm going to do a bit of a Dave Whitty on that. If you're in Britain, you'll know what that means. He does a presentation about COVID every night on the news, and he doesn't know how to use PowerPoint, so he just has to say next slide. So that's going to be me today. So the first thing is just to introduce API. This is our version 2. It is effectively eventually to replace the original version, but we're going to have a bit of a one-stop shop approach to this as well. Just as we're going through, a bit of a shameless plug here. We've just on our website launched a new area called PyLearn, and it's where all the documentation is. So if you go on to panintelligence.com, you'll see at the top PyLearn. On the right hand side, there's the Pi documentation. That's the full documentation that people used to search, but you can now search it. It's interactive. You can see everything in there. It looks really, really cool. Great place to find out what's new and what's going on within Pan Intelligence. Also on there, there's the bit that Ming's going to refer to in his presentation, which is a link to the new Pi API documentation. It's in a thing called Swagger. So anyone who's familiar with Swagger APIs, it will look very familiar to you when you get in there. The final bit of the shameless plug on there as well is we've also got Pi Community on there. The idea of Pi Community is you can pose questions, ask how-to type things about Pan Intelligence, and the idea is now that the community can start to get involved and answer some of those questions as well. It's like a voting system, so whoever answers the most questions and their questions get liked the most and things like that will start to rise to the top of the league table from within there. Okay, so really now on to the Pi API, and the first question really would be why have we created a new API? Why have we bothered? What was wrong with the old API? And essentially, one of the main reasons for needing to move on to the new API is to remove the last piece of legacy Java code. Now, where we talk about legacy Java code, it probably means less to you than it does to us, but really it's the bit of the software that used to sit behind the Flex environment. And as all of you all know, Flash is a long distant memory, certainly for us now. So we really want to keep refining and cleaning up the product from that point of view. So it was really important that we built something new. The existing API, or the old API, was built in XML, and XML just isn't the way people speak through APIs anymore. They speak using JSON. So the new API is coded in JSON, and it just looks the way that people would expect an API to be. Most people are used to writing code against JSON these days as opposed to XML, so it just makes the whole thing easier. We've also taken the opportunity just to make sure it's as standard as possible. So we've used the Open API v3 standard to build, and that's why you'll see that we're deployed through Swagger. And Swagger is a really consistent application, and it also allows you to document things in a very unified, universal way. So as you'll see when Ming shows you some of the documentation side of this, you'll be able to see that it looks pretty familiar to you, hopefully. My middle phrase there is, oh my God, I'm going to have to change everything. This is really, you know, please don't panic and start thinking that you're going to have to start ripping code out and doing things that you've written against what you might hear us refer to as the old API. I still call it the existing API. Don't panic, we're not going to be removing support for the old API, certainly not in 2021. And really, we're going to want to see and talk to partners and users about that transition, just to make sure it's as smooth and as timely, and we don't put you under any pressure at all to move from the API to not. What you'll also notice between the old and the new API is the endpoints are very familiar. So really, hopefully, it should be a relatively simple job of taking your code and changing the endpoints that it calls, as opposed to feeling like you're going to have to start from scratch and go back to the beginning. So please, you know, don't panic. If you have any concerns at all, then just get in touch with us. And finally on this slide, most of this presentation is going to be Ming rolling up his sleeves and demonstrating exactly how the API works. Next slide, please, Holly. Okay, so a common question sometimes when we start talking about API is almost first, should I be using the API? It's not something I use at the moment. Is it something I should be aware of? What's it for? What does it affect me? And really, what we're going to concentrate on and concentrate in the demo are some common API uses. And the most common use of our API is for single sign-on. So that's where people will, from their own application, call into the Pan Intelligence API, get a token, and they'll use that in subsequent calls to charts, pages, dashboards. And from that point of view, then the user synchronization happens, because obviously you don't want a user having to log back into Pan Intelligence, certainly not if it's embedded in your own application. And to support that single user case, people obviously then have to do the user synchronization, because there needs to be a user account in Pan Intelligence. So commonly people are doing things like get users, they're creating users, they're applying content, so allocating roles for these users. They might be resetting the passwords or force the change in that password if they need a user to do that. They'll be applying user restrictions, applying or creating variables, and deleting users. So making sure that they can keep those users and user credentials in line with their own application. And that's a really common part of how people use the dashboard. And Ming's going to take you through some examples of that. He's also going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek today of what's coming up in the January release, because we've even made that filter and the searching a little bit neater and a little bit easier, but I'll leave Ming to take you through that piece. A couple of other scenarios that people use the API for are getting a list of charts, and the other one is to interact with the data connection. So changing the passwords within a data connection, creating tables, creating objects. And I've left the create join in pink because that's actually something that you can't do with the legacy API, the old API, and it's something that you can now do with the new API. So another reason, if you want to do sort of data connection work, then the new API is absolutely the way to go from that point of view, because you would have found that problematic on the old API. Next slide, please, Holly. And finally, as well, just to give you a little bit of comfort around this. Obviously, we'd all be in a room and you'd be laughing hilariously at my hilarious slide here, but Ming's going to show you how the old and the new can work together. So the old being markup, the new being JSON, and they can coexist from that point of view. So Ming's going to show you how to do that. Now, that's all I'm going to do, because I think the proof's in the pudding, and you're much keener to see the nuts and bolts of this, and Ming's going to show you how to do that. Leaves me for what next. Ask loads of questions in this. Anything that's on your mind, ask them. Ming will do his very best to answer those questions. Anything he can't answer, we'll come back to you on from that point of view. But Ming, over to you.
Cool. So I wouldn't be able to share my screen at the moment. So Holly, you might actually need to give me need to give me access. Okay, so okay then.
Just a couple of questions that have come in. Yes, this will be recorded, and we'll be sending out a marketing email afterwards with documentation and the recording.
Cool then. So I don't have a PowerPoint slide, so I'm gonna go a little bit more dry on my side. So this is my preparation basically. But firstly, I would like to say that the API starts to become available on the December release. So if you are not on the December release, you wouldn't be able to use that. But ideally, we want to sort of like use the latest release, which is when I say the latest, I mean the proper release of this month, January. So then currently we don't even have the documentation available for January based on what the URL says. So if I pick out the release, it will automatically redirect me to the latest version, which is December 2020. But I'm just going to show you the latest of what we have on the dev side. If I put master over here, this is not recommended for you to do. It's just to show that what we have over here in the new version. So there's a new section over here to allow you to do filtering and those kind of things. I'm going to show you this documentation instead for now, because this is what you're going to get in January. So go back to the example that Ken had earlier. Basically, people might want to do user synchronization. So for example, on your system, you create a user on your side. You want to automatically put that user into the Pi application. Then you can just write an API call to do that, so that it does the user synchronization. So it can do user creation, updating, and deletion. So if we look at the documentation, the API documentation over here, we've got like a get, which in general, without an ID, is just to get a whole list of users that you have access to. When I say you, I mean the logged in user. So I'm going to show that a little bit later. And then you can do a post, which is to create, and then a get with an ID that gets one user. And then you have a put to update and a delete to delete one user, for example. So in this case, if I create a user on my system, I want to automatically have a user created in Pi as well. Then all I need to do is just filing a request using such an API endpoint. So then if I do an update, I can synchronize that using the API. And finally, if I want to just get a user for whatever reason, I can do that as well. So if we hop back to the, if we go to somewhere that I can show you how to do all of this. Oh yeah, it's worth mentioning that we've got this tokens one, which is the one that allows people to log in. So that's actually the first one that I would like to show to people. So this is connecting to a dashboard that sits on my machine. And the API URL is going to be like this. And you should be able to figure it out by looking at here. All you need to do is just changing something like this, something over here. But basically, if you actually do a try out, it sort of shows you a URL that the documentation is trying to connect to. So you just need to change a few details over here to get your version of the URL. So then going back to, this is a tool called Postman. It's a good tool for sort of doing some API temporary interaction. So if I supply the URL and then following the documentation, it needs to be a post, and then I need to supply something in the header, having an accept header to be application JSON. So then over here I have an accept header. So instead of putting this, I put accept instead. Then I need to supply the authorization, setting it to basic, and then provide the username and the password. Then if I hit that, it's going to give me a token. And this token is very, very important for the rest of the API request and response. So everything now, don't need to use such an authorization. They use the token instead. So that's going to be exactly how you do it if you want to sort of like do user creation. So then you basically use the tokens endpoint to get a token by supplying the username and the password. And this supports clear text, or you can sort of like convert that into base 64. So exports both. Base 64 is sort of like the go-to way of doing that. I'm just putting the clear text version over here just to show that that's how I can do it. Then when I have the token available, all I need to do is, let's say I want to list all the charts, or let's say I want to create a list of users, for example. So if I want to create a list of users, then I just need to go back to the API documentation and then go to the user section. And then let me try to find my user section. Yeah, so users put over here. So then if I run and execute to get an URL display over here, now I put that onto my new tab. And then to create a user, I'll need to set that to post. And then the port number of my server is this. So I'll change the localhost to that. Yeah, and it's 8080. So before I try to do a post, I would like to see whether this is the correct URL. So all I need to do is just turn that into a get instead. And then in the header, I need to supply, based on what it says over here, an accept, which is application JSON. And then content type, which is also application JSON. And then, so this is doing a post, but I will actually need to have an authorization, which is a standard way. If you have done anything related to API, this is a standard way of hitting an endpoint to log in. So then it's going to be bearer, and then putting. I was intending to copy the token. So if I copy that and put that into here, there we go. I've got the token now. So instead of doing a put to create, I'm gonna run a get instead. So this get is using the identical URL, but it allows me to sort of like get a whole list of users, for example. So now I know that this URL is correct. I can turn that into a post. So then in terms of how to create a user, if we go back to the API, it will tell me exactly what's mandatory and what's optional. So if I, this is the user section. If I go to the schema section, you say user code is mandatory. Now I also need to provide a password. So in this case, it's called client password. So user code over here. So if I come over here and then say in the body, and I want to actually just write some JSON. So if I say user code is going to be like hello one, for example, and then the password is going to be dash 4, for example. So then I can actually, so before I hit this, I actually want to show you the dashboard. So on my dashboard, I've got 3 users. But if I hit that API endpoint to create such a user, you will see that instantly available over here. So if I do a send, and then it gives me a, oh, okay, so I need to assign a parent, saying that the parent is going to be, I might miss something. Yeah, parent ID, that's what I missed over here. So I need to say parent ID, let's say 1. And the reason I put one there is because I know one is the super admin is this one. So if I want to say this guy ID2 is the parent, I'll actually put 2 instead. So now if I hit send, it creates such a user. So this user becomes available on the system and the ID is 463, for example. So let's say I refresh the page. And when that becomes available, then that user hello1 is already created over here. So I only just provided the minimum required fields. Obviously, you can provide more things based on what's documented over here to create a user. You can say the user type can be something else. So 0 is admin, and then 1 is designer, and so on. So if you don't provide anything, it defaults to 2, which is like a normal user. That's why a user was created with the user type as user, for example. Obviously, you can also specify the default permissions, or, the permissions that you would like to assign to the user, and so on. So you can do all of this on this screen via the API. It doesn't do variables and restrictions because variables and restrictions will be created after the user is created. So then if you want to do stuff like that, then basically after you create a user, you can do user variable creation, user restriction creation as well, if you want. So the concept is pretty much identical. You just hit a different endpoint, and then that allows you to sort of like do user variable creation and all sorts of different things based on what's documented over here. Pretty much exactly the same as I keep hitting this page instead because I like so much about the Pound Intelligence new website. So you can do pretty much what you can do over here by doing it using the API. So you can do categories, users, roles, and then you can assign. So the user access and category access, they're basically doing some assignments. So you can do that via the API by doing some sort of like, if you want to assign a category to a user, sorry, this is deletion. If you want to assign a category to a user, then you go to this endpoint and then you supply the ID of a category to assign to that user. Then you will create that assignment. So that's that element. Then you can do data connection as what Ken said as well. And then you can create some variables. So pretty much everything about configuration, you can do that using the API. So let me see what else over here. So you've got like user synchronization. Yeah, so in terms of embedding. So people, if people want to embed a dashboard into a iframe or whatever, then basically all they need to do is supplying some sort of code that looks like this. Let me just zoom in to make it more clear. So this is an example of embedding one chart into an iframe that has a bit of like a width and height of 500 and 500 pixels. So then all you need to do if you want to embed a chart is providing a token like this. Then you will be able to automatically log into the dashboard and display that one chart on your screen. So the way to get such a token is basically identical to what I have just shown you. You just need to fire the tokens endpoint, and then that gives you such a token. Obviously, you don't want to always log in as user the super admin. So you create a particular user, they would like to have such a behavior. Then you can just sort of like use that user to log in, and you need to make sure that user has proper access, which means they have the access to that chart, for example. So then they will be able to, just by doing something like this, to embed the dashboard into an iframe to show one chart, or even show the whole category, or even show the whole dashboard. So that's embedding. And then in terms of resetting password, you can also do that via the API as well. So all you need to do is just, let's say I want to reset this user's password that I have just created. So if I go back to the API documentation, then all I need to do is just updating that user and force that user to reset password. So if I go to the put section over here, so I need to supply the user ID, which is what I have just got over here. So this user ID is 463. I'm gonna cover later about how you can actually make this easier, because you don't always remember that ID is 463. So let's say I want to update this user. So before I do a put request, it's always good for me to just do a get to see whether I get the exact user. So I can do a get to get that. Right, so this is the user that I have just created called hello1. So then if I want to make changes to that user, I do a put instead. So in the body, I no longer need to supply this. By supplying such a password, I can supply the password. So this is a password that I would like to set the user with. But then this time, I want to force changing password. So you can look at the documentation to see what that means. If we set this to true, the user will be required to change the password themselves when they log in. So then I would say force changing password and then set that to true. And this time I don't need to set the user code. It doesn't allow me to set the user code after I create the user, because it's not available. That user code thingy is not available when I look at the put request. It's available when I look at the post request, but it's not over here because you can't change the user code in our system after you create a user. So then if I say force changing password, then basically it will force reset that user with such a password, and then ask the user to log in and change their password when they access the dashboard. So a good example of using something like this is if somebody forget about their password in your system, you can just use something in your system to auto generate a password for the Pi application, and then you just hit such an endpoint with the password that you generate. Then you can send an email out to somebody saying that now we've got some new details of your password, because you're saying you want to reset your password. So this is the password that we auto generate for you to use for one time only, and then straight afterwards you need to change your password. So by providing something like this, it will force them to change that password after they use the one-time usage password, if that makes sense at all. So that's that, for example. This is the force changing password. And then finally, well, not finally, I've got another bit as well. So a new feature, the reason we want to show the January version of the API endpoints is because we've got something more user friendly for you to do now. So if I forget about like the ID is 463, for example, to get the new user called hello1, then what I can do instead is doing a search. So I would actually say, because this user has so many different fields, I would actually want to find someone. So if I say user code equals to hello1, for example. So I intentionally put hello1 like this, so it doesn't give me anything. But if I do a like, for example, it will actually return me a user, because according to the documentation, let me just go back to the documentation. An EQ as an operator, so we supply, we can provide different kind of operators over here. An EQ is like a 100% match, and then a greater than, if you have numbers and so on, you can just do anything greater than that. It allows comparing characters as well. If it's character, if it's some sort of characters, then it's going to be alphabetical search. So anything greater than A, for example, then it will give you B, C, D, and so on. And then you've got less than, greater, equals to, and then less, equals to, and less than. And then you've got like a not equals to. And then you've got a like, which is case insensitively contains some text. That's why over here, when I put a like over here like this, it will give me the result that I like. Even if I do something like this, it will still give me the same result, because in my system, as you can see, in my dashboard, the users, I've got this few users. So if I put I, for example, then no, I can't find anybody. So admin, oh yeah, I can actually find the super admin as well. So if I say like with an I, for example, this time I get 2 users. So there's one over here. Actually, there are a few. So Ming also has an I, and then admin has an I. Admin has an I. So I'm looking for user code, for example. And then hello doesn't have an I. So yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. So if I do a hello, for example, then I can actually use such a way to find the user ID. Then I can make use of that user ID to update or whatever if I want to. If that makes sense. So that's like a search feature for the API. One last thing from me, which is how do people actually have the old and the new API working together? Basically, at the moment, you're using the XML version of the API, which is the documentation sort of looks like this. Potentially, if you are still using that, it doesn't give you too much information. So if I go to the category section, for example, it does tell you what sort of views you can provide. It doesn't tell you that certain things are sort of like has to be in certain format and basically what the URL should be and those kind of things. And it doesn't provide all the features. So if you hit any problems using if you are still on the old API and if you hit any problem using the old API, then you can just have that particular thing. Let's say categories no longer work for you. Then you can have categories using the new API while everything else is still using the old API. And you don't actually need to change too much. But I do actually want to suggest a pattern that you can use. Anything in your system that you use the Pi application, I would actually propose that you need to create sort of like a domain concept on your side to represent a Pi user, for example. So then if in your system, you only use the user code, then you don't even need to know the rest of what the Pi application offers. So then you create such an object in your system. Then when you make a request to the Pi application for create user, for example, then all you need to do is just assembling such a user that you use in your system and then return to your user. Then let's say you want to swap the XML implementation to the JSON, the new implementation. Then all you need to do is just handling all of them internally. So because your application is only using something like this is controlled by you. So you never get any sort of like migration or inconsistency, that kind of problem. So if your system use user code 1,000,000 times, you use this one, which is never changed. So if in our system, we change the user code to username, for example, you still set username to user code and you use user code in your system. So then from that perspective, it doesn't really matter whether you swap to the new JSON API or you're using the XML one, it's all handled at a layer that you control. Then your application doesn't have any migration problem and you can have the old and the new working together at the same time. So If you need any further information about the technically how to solve this kind of things, we can offer some help as well. That's pretty much it from me.
Thanks, Ming.
Cool.
We've got a couple of questions. When can we start using the new API?
So the January release is the first time they've got a proper release of the API. And one important thing that you need to make sure is at the time you use try to use the API, you need to actually make sure that you're actually on the January version, or at least that version. So to access to find out what version you have, you just go to the Pi application and /version, for example. So over here, if I put version, then it gives me my version. This is a development version, so it doesn't put anything. But in your application, it will tell you exactly what version you have. So then, if you see that being sort of like January or December, then you can use the API. If you're on November, then you need to update your dashboard to be able to use it. If that makes sense. So yeah, that's explained over here basically.
Okay, thanks, Ming. So a question about when the API will stop being supported. So as Ken mentioned at the start, we don't have a date as terms of when we will stop supporting it. So you've got at least 2021 it'll still be supported for, and if any changes are made to the point at which we will support it, obviously they'll be communicated, but you'll be looking at 2022 around the time that that'll stop being supported. So Ming, a question, can I get any help converting to the new API?
Yeah, so converting to the new API is, I suppose it's just letting the account manager know, and then we just sort something out. But potentially, the suggestion we are going to make is developing something like this to have the old and the new working together, and then you just slowly swap out, create users, create categories, and so on, and then you just retire the old API step by step.
Okay, thanks, Ming. There's one as well to say that this customer would like the ability to roll out new front-end content to our Pi users. This will consist of new categories and charts. Will this be possible within version 2?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? It was not quite clear.
Yep. So we have the ability to roll out new front-end content to our Pi users. This will consist of new categories and charts that they build within Pi Intelligence. Will this be available within the new API?
Yeah, so are you saying creating categories and so on via the API? Then the answer is yes. And sorry, so charts is a slightly different thing. So charts at the moment, if you look at the API documentation, it does have charts. But the only thing you can do is just to get a whole list of charts, or get one chart, or delete a chart. You wouldn't be able to create a chart, and we still need to think harder about this, because a chart is so difficult to create from the API's perspective, because if we look at the application, a chart is so complicated internally. It's got all sorts of different things related together and so on. So it's not an isolated element. If you change the data point over here, it automatically changes the colors, it swap out certain things and so on. If you want to change the chart type, certain data point will be gone because it's not spotted by a particular chart type. So there's so much interrelationship behind the scene. That's why, in my opinion, I actually strongly recommend people to use the dashboard for chart creation. So this UI is actually some usability tool. It's a usability tool for you to create charts and so on, basically. So if you really want to do stuff with charts, then at some point I would actually suggest doing using data connection export import. So we can make the data export import available on the API, so that you can actually use the API to import the whole data connection, for example. So if you want to sort of like create a consistent dashboard with one that you already have, then basically you export the data connection of one dashboard, which includes, let me just try one. Okay, so this one doesn't have charts, but you get the idea. So the data connection contains the data connection, tables, objects, and those kind of things. And then it contains charts, it contains categories. So you can just export all of them in a file and then import that file via the API. Then you can just use that to synchronize the data connection charts categories to a different dashboard if you want to. So that would be a more advanced, or actually it's a more sophisticated solution if you want to do synchronization, if that makes sense at all.
All right.
So charts, yeah.
And it's and like we said at the start, this is like functionality. It has got additional features in the new API than the other one had. But if there is anything else that you would like to use the API for that's not currently listed, let us know. So there's obviously no guarantee that we'll include that. But if you let us know the reasons why and anything that you're struggling with, then that would be really helpful. I think that's all the questions. If anybody has any other questions, just pop them in the chat now, and we'll be able to get them answered. I think that's it, Ming. There's only one other thing that I wanted to show. If you could just stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
That'd be great. Whilst the questions. Just let me know if you can see my screen. Ming?
Yes.
Okay, so can you see the Pan Intelligence API documentation?
Yes, I can see that. Yes.
Fab. Okay, so when you go onto our website, so here, this is our new branded website. If you go into Learn Pi, there's some new features. So Ken mentioned those briefly at the start of the at the call. Pi Community is a new feature that we've got. This is where our customers can all come and ask questions about the product. So it's a place where people can ask questions or raise queries, and then the whole community can respond with best practice or answers to any questions. If you want to submit any questions or respond to a question, you just need to register, but then your responses will come up here. So this is really new. We launched it this week, and a lady called Karen, who manages content of responses. In addition to that, we also have Pi documentation. So again, under the same banner, this will give you user guides. So if anybody's familiar with getting to know Pi and the likes, this is where you so this is a really neat feature. You'll be able to use search functionality, etc., to be able to look up everything that we host in here. So let me just check if we've got any other questions. Not, but let people jump off. Okay, yeah, I think we do. Can we use the import export using API with the different version on Pi? That's one for you, Ming.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So export import currently is not documented over here, which means we need to make it available if people want to use that on the API. So at the moment, the January release doesn't include that. It can actually be added to February release. One thing related to export import that I would like to explain is it only allows importing the same version that you export. So when I say the same version, I mean using the same version of the dashboard. So let's say you're on November, you export a file and you upgrade your dashboard to December, you can't import the file into the December version. So you can only export that in November and put that into November, export that from December, put that into December. So if you want to synchronize the data from one dashboard to another, you need to make sure that the two dashboards, they are on the same version. So that's a restriction related to export and import. With such a restriction, it's actually not too difficult to make the API available for export and import. We just had a call yesterday with another customer, and then what they needed to do is basically they've got a development environment and a test environment and a live environment. So they want to make sure that they develop the dashboard in their dev environment, transition that to the test environment, and then afterwards go live. So then the plan for them is to actually use the export import using the API. So the plan for them is to make sure that the development version, test version, or live version of the dashboard gets updated first, and then subsequently they import whatever that you create using the dev version and transition that forward. So the dashboard will be on the same version and then do the import. So for them, they solve the problem in such a particular manner. So that's one example of using export import and keeping with that particular condition. So we probably wouldn't be able to take out that condition for quite a while. That is just something to make people aware. Just because internally we are changing we're improving the chart structure and those kind of things. But we don't want you to sort of like have problems when we do some sort of like data conversion and migration and those kind of things. We want to hide all of those complexity and make your life easier. So that's why the only restriction, which is this versioning, is the only restriction that we put into the system. If that makes sense at all.
Thanks, Link. Just two more before we jump off. If they are using OpenID Connect, can they use OpenID access token to access our API instead of the token endpoint?
I haven't used OpenID Connect to try the API, but at the moment, the only way to log into the API as developed is just using a token that we generate using the dashboard. So maybe I don't understand the scenario, but I can't imagine why people will use OpenID Connect to try to use the API. Because if you want to use the API, this particular user that tries to sort of like edit users and so on needs to have very, very high level privilege. So it'll be like it's probably not going to be the super admin, but it will probably be an admin just lower than the super admin, because otherwise you don't have access to all sorts of different things. Then you don't have permission to do stuff using the API regardless. So you end up creating a user in the dashboard with very high level privilege, and then use that user particularly just for the API. So you probably need to keep something in your system about the username and the password and use that for the API. So it's actually probably less likely that you use OpenID Connect to do such an activity, if that makes sense at all.
Okay, and then finally, this is obviously related to a couple of people have been asking about the creation of charts via the API. Are there any plans to implement the creation of charts via the API? I think we've probably covered this today, not at the moment, but again, you're saying mainly it's probably quite complex to do that.
Yeah, so that's why at the moment we are hiding the complexity on the export import, and then try to do some internal changes. So ideally, we want to make that available, but looking at the structure, is at this stage is still very, very complex. So as an API user, you want to know that the API is actually quite easy to use as well. So I know looking at the documentation, probably you think it's just hitting like a post request or put request to update something or create something. But behind the scene, it is related to so many different things to get one thing working. then as an API user, you get really frustrated as well. So we want to make sure that we don't have such a low usability experience as an API user from your perspective.
Fab. Thanks, Ming. That's it. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining the webinar. As Ming said, if you have any further questions, there is the documentation area which I've just pointed you to on the website, but please get in contact with your account manager if you have any particular questions or queries in terms of how you would like to use the API. So Adrian, I've seen your question. I'll be in touch at a recent call and we'll be able to go through in a little bit more detail how that would work for your use case. So if anybody has any particular use cases or questions, then please just get in contact with your account manager and then we'll be able to look at them on an individual basis. But thank you all for attending. So many of you have joined today, and I know it's quite a dry topic on API as well. I say dry, it is for some of us. But thank you, Ming and Ken, for your involvement as well. So that's been really helpful. Thank you, everybody, and yeah, good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.